Inflation continues to persist in the United States, and prematurely claiming victory over it could have been a costly mistake for the Federal Reserve, which will now have to continue with a tight monetary policy to strengthen the dollar, with consequences for the market, which had expected the end of inflation and to avoid a recession, but is now facing a harsh reality. After inflation in the United States was 0.1% in December, slowing down compared to the monthly increase of recent years, the markets took with optimism what seemed to be the end of one of the worst periods of inflation in recent decades, and they assumed that a new version of the era of free money, with lower interest rates and a lot of money flooding the economy that also allowed them to avoid a recession, was about to begin. And during the period that this illusion lasted, the appetite for risk skyrocketed, the markets rose, and the dollar and other safe haven assets fell in price. However, a dose of reality arrived, curiously, with good news: the increase in employment in the United States. Because one of the most basic concepts of economics states that a strong labor market implies a strong demand, which can lead to higher inflation. This concept, known as the Phillips curve, is a simplified version of reality, and many variables influence whether it holds true. However, when the employment data came in higher than expected by the Federal Reserve, it was Jerome Powell himself who sounded the alarm and stated, "We did not expect it to be this strong." But it shows why we think this will be a process that takes quite a bit of time. And this would be supported by the numbers of the main inflation data in January a few days later, the CPI and the PPI. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, is a price index that measures the changes in the prices of goods and services that Americans typically consume, with food, housing, and transportation being the items with the greatest weight in this index. Therefore, if the prices of these items increase, it could lead to higher inflation data. In January, the CPI rose by 0.5%, which was in line with analysts' estimates. However, if this trend continues, inflation could exceed 6% by the end of the year, well above the Federal Reserve's annual inflation target of 2%. A few days later, the Producer Price Index, or PPI, was published. The PPI measures the change in the prices of products and services purchased by companies, and it registered an increase of 0.7% in January, which was well above the estimated value of 0.4%. All of this implies that the battle against inflation may not be won as easily as initially thought, and the effects that could be observed in the market could be similar to what happened in 2022. The Federal Reserve may need to raise interest rates, which can strengthen the dollar and make less risky assets like bonds more attractive than stocks and other risky investments. Higher interest rates can reduce consumption, encourage savings, and put pressure on economic growth. Because of this, when it was believed that inflation had been subdued, the market was expecting the Federal Reserve to halt its interest rate hikes and possibly even start lowering them in the coming months. This was expected to have a stimulative effect on the economy and even help prevent an economic crisis. Therefore, it's not surprising how optimistic the markets were. But can you return to that optimism? Why shouldn't inflation go down? Although January could have been an exception, and inflation could show signs of falling again in the coming months, more and more analysts are questioning whether the current measures are sufficient to achieve the Federal Reserve's annual inflation target of 2%. Some analysts even suggest that a higher target of 3% or 4% may be more reasonable in the current context. Because even though the Federal Reserve could raise rates and continue taking money out of the economy to achieve its goal, it could end up causing greater damage to the economy than the benefit of having inflation at 2% instead of 3% or 4%. And in general, those who propose this idea are basing it on the fact that the current economic reality is very different from that of previous years, primarily due to two deepening phenomena that could exert significant upward pressure on prices: the demographic crisis and deglobalization. The demographic crisis is notoriously affecting countries like China and Germany, two of the largest producers and exporters in the world. While in China a population reduction has already begun to take place, its main problem is the dependency ratio, which is the relationship between people of working age and people who are retired or who are still too young to work. This dependency ratio will likely affect the economic growth of this country and will cause lower growth in production, which was one of the factors that during the last decades helped to maintain low inflation despite the expansionist monetary policies of the central banks. In Germany, although there is also a version of this problem, it is characterized more by showing the other side of the coin in this crisis, and that is the absence of workers. Not precisely in basic jobs, but in advanced ones, because in the coming years the generation with the most studies and experience will retire and the country will have to replace 2 engineers with 30 years of experience for a millennial with 30 years of life. All this affects production directly and affects innovation and entrepreneurship, also compromising production in the long term and generating inflationary pressures where they did not exist before. The other phenomenon is deglobalization, because after decades of economic openness where countries around the world became economically integrated and their production chains became intertwined, enabling you to watch this video on a platform from the United States, with a device assembled in China, with Chilean copper, batteries made with Congolese cobalt, Taiwanese microchips, made using Dutch machines while drinking Colombian coffee, and with a North Korean hacker stealing your data. The trend could be changing, and the increase in protectionism, trade wars, pandemics, invasions, among other events have led to the possibility that the globalization process is coming to an end, and this will necessarily imply an increase in production costs by changing the paradigm of international trade from everything being produced where it is cheaper or of better quality, to being produced internally or with inputs from neighboring and allied countries. And many companies have opted to diversify their production chains so that they do not depend exclusively on China, not because doing so is more economical, but because it will allow them to obtain more security. On the other hand, there are also short-term trends that could increase inflation, with the first of these being the reopening of China, which, although it will be accompanied by greater production in the best scenario, also comes with one of the largest groups of consumers in the world re-entering the market with savings at record levels after not being able to spend freely during almost 3 years that were in intermittent quarantines, and this demand could increase the price of commodities and put pressure on inflation around the world. And hand in hand with this is the invasion of Ukraine, which implies that one of the largest exporters of seed oil, corn, wheat, and iron will be out of the market for a few years. And also because of the sanctions on Russia, which is one of the largest exporters of crude oil, natural gas, wheat, metals such as nickel, copper, aluminum, platinum, among an infinity of natural resources, will not have them available in the same quantity for the international market. Additionally, it was the main energy supplier to Europe and Germany, which could see serious problems in its heavy, energy-intensive industry, which until last year had a stable and reliable supply of energy. And Russia, in response to the sanctions, has reduced oil production, which, given greater demand from China and lower production from Russia, could again increase in price. It has not only been the actions of the Federal Reserve that have helped bring inflation down in recent months, but also the fall in oil prices from $120 a barrel in June 2022 to around $75 at the time of making this video. For all of this, volatility and unclear trends in the market could be very common in the coming weeks until a clear idea of the direction inflation may take is established. This will influence the decisions of the Federal Reserve and the monetary policy they decide to pursue, which could have implications for the United States and the global economy. But what could go wrong by leaving the fate of the world economy in the hands of the Federal Reserve? If you enjoyed this video, you may find this one useful as well. I would also like to know your opinion on whether you think inflation will decrease in the next few months. See you next time.